The city of New Orleans has always been a place of mystery, a melting pot of cultures with a history steeped in legend, music, and shadows. But in the early 1900s, beneath the sound of jazz and the scent of Creole cooking, something dark lurked in the streets. Fear gripped the city, not because of ghosts or folklore, but because of a real-life nightmare, a faceless predator who would go down in history as the Axeman of New Orleans. His crimes were brutal, his presence a specter that haunted the nights, and his identity an enigma that remains unsolved to this day. It began in 1918, a time when the world was already burdened with hardship. The Great War had left its scars, and the Spanish flu was claiming thousands of lives. New Orleans, a city known for its resilience, tried to move forward, its streets filled with merchants, musicians, and families trying to make a living. But then, the terror began. Without warning, homes were invaded in the dead of night, their inhabitants brutally attacked with an axe. There was no clear pattern at first, no explanation for the violence, only bloodied walls and a growing sense of dread. The victims, often Italian immigrants or grocers, were left maimed or lifeless, with the killer slipping away unnoticed. The randomness of the attacks left everyone in a state of paranoia. Was it personal? Was it revenge? Was there some hidden message in his choice of victims? The police were at a loss. Crime scenes yielded little to no evidence. No valuables were stolen. No forced entry was apparent in most cases. The weapon, always an axe, was never brought by the killer but rather taken from the victims' own homes. It was as if the Axeman was challenging the city, mocking their inability to stop him. Newspapers capitalized on the fear, printing sensational headlines that only deepened the hysteria. People speculated wildly, creating theories that ranged from the mundane to the supernatural. Was he a madman, a demon, or something in between? The brutality of his crimes suggested he was no ordinary man. His ability to vanish without a trace made him feel almost untouchable. Rumors swirled through the neighborhoods, whispered fears of who might be next. Some believed the killer was a member of the mafia, enforcing his own form of justice. Others thought he was an escaped lunatic, striking at random with no motive beyond sheer bloodlust. As the body count rose, so did the desperation. New Orleans, a city accustomed to crime and hardship, had never seen anything like this. Locking doors was not enough. The Axeman did not need an invitation. He came and went as he pleased, his only calling card the devastation he left behind. The people of New Orleans were living in a waking nightmare, unsure when or where he would strike again. And the most chilling fact of all, he was just getting started. In the early 1900s, New Orleans was a city of contrasts, a place where wealth and poverty coexisted, where culture thrived amid crime, and where the shadows of history loomed over its people. The streets were alive with music, the scent of Creole spices filled the air, and the Mississippi River carried the lifeblood of trade and industry. But beneath the vibrant energy of the city, there was an undercurrent of unease. Crime was not uncommon, but the kind of terror the Axeman would soon unleash was something. At the time, the city had a growing population of Italian immigrants, many of whom ran small grocery stores and local businesses. These grocers worked tirelessly, often living above their shops with their families. They were hardworking, determined, and often viewed as outsiders in the broader New Orleans society. As the Axeman's attacks began to unfold, a disturbing pattern emerged. Many of his victims were Italian-American shopkeepers and their families. Whether this was coincidence or intentional was New Orleans was no stranger to corruption, and its law enforcement was often plagued by inefficiency and scandal. The police force struggled with limited resources, and many officers were susceptible to bribery and political influence. Solving violent crimes was already a challenge, but tracking a killer who seemed to strike at random, leaving no clear evidence behind, was an almost impossible task. Without modern forensic science, investigators were left with little more than speculation and circumstance. The city's newspapers played a significant role in shaping public perception of the Axeman. Sensational headlines stoked fear, filling the pages with gruesome details and desperate pleas for justice. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed the Axeman was a supernatural entity, a demon haunting the streets of New Orleans. Others believed he was part of a secret society, enforcing his own form of justice. The more the public speculated, the harder it became to separate fact from fiction. In the homes of New Orleans, families began reinforcing their doors, keeping weapons close at hand, and praying that they would not be next. Some men stood guard at night, determined to protect their loved ones. But no matter how many precautions were taken, the Axeman always found a way in. The city was on edge, and with each attack, the fear grew stronger. As darkness fell over New Orleans each night, people whispered about the monster that walked among them. Was he a man driven by madness, or something more sinister? Whatever the answer, one thing was clear: no one was safe, and the Axeman was far from finished. The terror in New Orleans truly began on the night of May 22, 1918. Joseph and Catherine Maggio, an Italian-American couple who owned a small grocery store, were asleep in their home when an intruder crept inside. Without warning, the attacker struck them both with an axe, hacking at their skulls with brutal force. Joseph died almost instantly, his body left in a grotesque state of mutilation. Catherine, though gravely wounded, managed to cling to life for a few moments, but the injuries were too severe. The crime scene was horrifying, the brutality unlike anything the police had seen before. Blood was splattered across the walls and floor, and yet, strangely, no valuables had been taken. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious motive. The only clue was the murder weapon itself, an axe that belonged to the Maggios, left behind as if to mock investigators. Next to the bodies, a chilling message was scrawled in chalk on the wall. "Mrs. Maggio will sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony." The cryptic "no." The attack sent shockwaves through the city. It wasn't just the gruesomeness of the crime that frightened people, it was the randomness. The Maggios had no known enemies, no history of conflict. Why them? Why now? Fear spread like wildfire. If someone could break into a family home and commit such savagery without reason, then no one was safe. The police worked tirelessly to find a suspect. They questioned neighbors, examined the crime scene, and searched for any possible leads. One of Joseph Maggio's brothers, who lived in the same building, claimed he had heard strange noises in the middle of the night but had assumed it was nothing out of the ordinary. By the time he checked, he found the bodies in a pool of blood. Another clue pointed to a discarded straight razor found near the scene, which may have been used to inflict additional injuries on the victims before the axe was used. However, despite these findings, no strong leads emerged. Newspapers wasted no time sensationalizing the case, warning readers that a deranged killer was loose in the city. Speculation ran rampant. Some believed it was the work of a madman, a random act of insanity. Others suspected a deeper conspiracy, perhaps tied to the mafia or secret criminal dealings. Yet, there was no proof to support any theory. As the investigation dragged on, New Orleans residents grew more fearful. Some began locking their doors at night, an unusual practice in the warm climate where many people slept with windows open. Others armed themselves, convinced the killer would strike again. But despite the precautions, nothing could prepare the city for what was to come. The Axeman had only just begun his reign of terror. As the summer of 1918 wore on, the people of New Orleans remained on edge. The savage murders of Joseph and Catherine Maggio had left an unshakable fear in the city, but there was no time to recover. The Axeman struck again, this time with even more brutality. On the night of June 27, 1918, a new wave of terror began when grocer Louis Bessumer and his mistress, Harriet Lowe, were found bleeding and barely alive in their home. Bessumer had been struck in the head with an axe while he slept, his skull fractured but not immediately fatal. Harriet Lowe suffered devastating injuries, deep gashes across her face and head, but she clung to life. The police arrived at the scene to find the couple in a pool of their own blood, the crime eerily similar to the Maggio case. Once again, no valuables were stolen, and the axe used in the attack belonged to the victims themselves. There was no forced entry, only a removed door panel, as if the attacker had slipped into their home silently, undetected. Despite her critical condition, Harriet Lowe remained conscious long enough to speak to the police, though her statements would prove more confusing than helpful. At one point, she accused Bessumer himself of being her attacker, claiming he had assaulted her in a fit of rage. Later, she changed her account and suggested an unknown man had been responsible. These inconsistencies complicated the investigation, and before detectives could gain any clarity, she succumbed to her injuries following a failed surgery. Her conflicting statements left behind a tangled mess of theories, but no solid answers. The case of Louis Bessumer and Harriet Lowe added to the mounting fear in New Orleans. The randomness of the attacks was unsettling. There was no clear motive, no pattern beyond the choice of weapon. The victims seemed to be chosen arbitrarily, and the lack of evidence made the investigation an exercise in futility. The newspapers ran wild with speculation, some suggesting that a lunatic was prowling the streets, while others whispered about a supernatural force. Meanwhile, the city was gripped by paranoia. Families refused to sleep, fearing that the Axeman could strike again at any moment. Italian grocers, in particular, felt as though they were being targeted, though no one could say why. The police, desperate for any leads, pursued every possible suspect, but with no witnesses and little forensic technology, they had nothing to work with. As the fear spread, the Axeman seemed to thrive on it. He had left another gruesome scene, another family shattered, and another mystery unsolved. The people of New Orleans could do nothing but wait, dreading the next inevitable attack. It was clear now this was no isolated incident. The city was under siege, and the Axeman had only just begun his campaign of terror. The Axeman's attacks were becoming increasingly brutal, and by the time August 1918 arrived, the entire city of New Orleans was in a state of hysteria. The brutal killings of Joseph and Catherine Maggio and the near-fatal attack on Louis Bessumer and Harriet Lowe had already instilled fear, but the Axeman was far from finished. On August 5, 1918, he struck again, and this time, his target was a pregnant woman. Anna Schneider, a 28-year-old who was 9 months pregnant, was sleeping in her home when the Axeman entered in the dead of night. With no warning, she was attacked viciously, her face and head left bloodied and battered by a sharp object. Unlike previous victims, Anna miraculously survived. Her husband returned home later that night to find her covered in blood but still conscious. She was rushed to the hospital, where, despite her severe injuries, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl just days later. The attack on Anna Schneider baffled investigators. Unlike previous victims, she and her husband were not Italian grocers, leading to further speculation about whether the killer had a specific pattern. Some believed he chose his victims at random, while others wondered if there was a deeper, more sinister motive. The only common thread was the sheer brutality of the attacks and the fact that the Axeman never stole anything. He wasn't a thief, he was a predator. As police struggled to find answers, the city's fear turned into desperation. Some residents began forming vigilante groups, determined to catch the killer themselves. Households fortified their doors and windows, and guns were kept within arm's reach. Yet, despite the precautions, the Axeman continued to evade capture. He came and went as he pleased, striking without warning and vanishing like a ghost. The newspapers, eager to fuel the panic, printed sensationalized stories about the Axeman, describing him as an unstoppable force of death. Some believed he was a supernatural entity, a demon who could slip through walls. Others suggested he was a madman, driven by an unknown compulsion to kill. Whatever the truth, the people of New Orleans knew one thing for certain: he was still out there, watching, waiting. Despite the horror she had endured, Anna Schneider's survival gave the city a rare glimmer of hope. If she could live through an attack by the Axeman, perhaps others could too. But any hope was short-lived. The Axeman was not finished, and the city braced itself for his next move. The nightmare was far from over. By mid-August 1918, the people of New Orleans were living in a state of fear unlike anything they had experienced before. The Axeman had already struck multiple times, each attack more gruesome than the last. His ability to slip into homes unnoticed, strike with unimaginable violence, and leave behind no trace of his identity made him seem almost inhuman. The city was desperate for answers, but none came. The police were chasing shadows, and the residents of New Orleans knew it was only a matter of time. On August 10, 1918, the Axeman proved that he was far from finished. His next victim was Joseph Romano, a 70-year-old man who lived with his two nieces. The young women awoke in the middle of the night to the sounds of a struggle. When they rushed into their uncle's room, they found him barely clinging to life, his head split open from repeated axe blows. The attacker had already vanished into the night, leaving behind only chaos and fear. Unlike previous attacks, this time there were witnesses. Romano's nieces had seen the figure fleeing into the darkness. Though their description was vague, they provided the first potential clue in the case. The man they saw was tall, heavy-set, and dressed in dark clothing. But beyond that, there was nothing. The police had a physical description, but no name, no motive, and no leads. The Axeman remained a faceless horror, striking at will. Romano was rushed to the hospital, but his injuries were too severe. He succumbed to his wounds 2 days later, adding yet another grim chapter to the Axeman's reign of terror. The attack on Romano shattered any illusion that the killer had a specific pattern. Unlike the previous victims, Romano was not a grocer, nor was he of Italian descent. His murder suggested that no one was safe, that the Axeman could strike anywhere, at any time, without rhyme or reason. The newspapers fanned the flames of fear, painting the Axeman as an unstoppable force of death. Theories ran rampant. Some believed he was a supernatural entity, while others thought he was a deranged psychopath with no clear motive. The lack of evidence only made the mystery more chilling. How could a killer leave behind no fingerprints, no footprints, and no trace of his identity? The attack on Joseph Romano sent New Orleans into full-blown panic. Families barricaded their homes, armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find, and prayed that they would not be next. But as the days turned to weeks, something unexpected happened. The Axeman disappeared. No new murders were reported, no new attacks were attributed to him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Had he been arrested for an unrelated crime? Had he died? Or was he simply biding his time, waiting for the purr? The fear that gripped New Orleans in 1918 carried over into the new year. The city had spent months on edge, expecting the Axeman to strike again at any moment. But after the attack on Joseph Romano, he had seemingly vanished. People cautiously began to hope that he was gone for good, that the nightmare had finally ended. Yet deep down, many feared that the silence was only temporary, that the killer was merely biding his time before unleashing another wave of terror. Their worst fears would soon be gone. On March 13, 1919, the city received a chilling message. The Times-Picayune Asterisk, one of New Orleans' most prominent newspapers, published a letter allegedly written by the Axeman himself. The letter, filled with strange and taunting language, claimed that he was a supernatural being from hell and that he had no intention of stopping his killing spree. He boasted about his power, mocked the authorities, and issued a terrifying ultimatum. The most infamous part of the letter was a bizarre declaration. The Axeman stated that on the night of March 19, he would once again roam the city, searching for victims. But he provided a way for people to save themselves. He claimed to have a deep love for jazz music and wrote that any house where a jazz band was playing that night would be spared. Those who refused to comply, he warned, would suffer the consequences. The letter read in part, Asterisk, I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing on the night I have mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it on Tuesday night will get the axe, asterisk. The letter sent the city into a frenzy. While some dismissed it as a hoax, others were too terrified to take any chances. In the days leading up to March 19, jazz musicians were booked solid. Homes, bars, and dance halls filled with the sound of jazz, the music echoing through the streets. The entire city seemed to turn into one massive jazz festival, a surreal response to the Axeman's threat. When the night finally arrived, New Orleans played its music and the Axeman did not strike. Whether it was because his demand had been met or because the letter had been a cruel joke all along, no one could say for sure. But for one eerie night, fear and defiance collided in a way that would forever be remembered as one of the most bizarre moments in true crime history. The Axeman had turned his killings into something else entirely, something theatrical, almost ritualistic. Yet even though he had not claimed a victim that night, the people of New Orleans knew the terror was far from over. The Axeman had made his presence known once more, and his hunger for violence had not been satisfied. It was only a matter of time before he struck again. The eerie night of jazz may have spared the city from violence, but it did nothing to stop the fear. If anything, the Axeman's letter had only made him more terrifying. He had transformed from a faceless killer into something more, an entity that the city had been forced to acknowledge and, in some ways, obey. But while New Orleans danced to the sound of jazz, The Axeman was watching, waiting for his next moment to strike. Months passed without an attack. People cautiously began to hope that perhaps the killer had been satisfied, that the music had somehow appeased him. But deep down, they knew it was only a matter of time. The Axeman was not finished. And on August 10, 1919, he made his return, proving that his bloodlust had not waned. That night, the Cortemilia family of Gretna, a town just across the Mississippi River from New Orleans, became the Axeman's latest victims. Charles Cortemilia, his wife Rosie, and their 2-year-old daughter Mary were asleep when the killer forced his way into their home. He struck with the same brutal precision as before, hacking at Charles and Rosie with his axe. Their young daughter, Mary, was not spared. The attack was swift, merciless, and devastating. When neighbors discovered the scene, they found Charles and Rosie barely alive, covered in blood and moaning in pain. Little Mary, however, had not survived. The horror of the attack sent shockwaves through the community. This time, the Axeman had crossed an unspeakable line. He had taken the life of an innocent child. Rosie Cortemilia, though gravely wounded, managed to regain consciousness in the hospital. In her weakened state, she named a suspect 2 local grocers, Orlando Giordano and his teenage son, Frank. The accusation sent the town into an uproar. The Giordanos were well-respected members of the community, and there was no evidence linking them to the crime. But in the desperate search for justice, the police arrested them anyway. The trial was swift, and both father and son were convicted. Frank, just 18 years old, was sentenced to hang, while his father received a life sentence. The people of Gretna felt some sense of closure, believing the Axeman had finally been caught. But months later, Rosie recanted her statement, admitting she had been wrong. The Giordanos were eventually released, but the damage had already been done. The real Axeman was still at large. The attack on the Cortemilia family marked one of the final known assaults attributed to the Axeman. Though no one knew it at the time, the terror was nearing its end. But his identity remained as elusive as ever. Had the Axeman been among them all along, watching as innocent men were accused in his place? Or was he preparing to disappear forever, slipping back into the shadows where he had come from? The attack on the Cortemilia family sent shockwaves through New Orleans and beyond. It was no longer just a city matter. The Axeman had crossed the Mississippi River into Gretna, expanding his reach. But despite the growing fear and the wrongful conviction of the Giordanos, no real progress was made in identifying the true killer. His methods remained unchanged, his escape routes undetectable. He was a ghost, leaving behind only blood and terror. Then, something unexpected happened. The Axeman stopped. After the attack on the Cortemilias in August 1919, there were no more reported killings attributed to him. Just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The city held its breath, waiting for the inevitable return, but it never came. Weeks turned into months, months into years, and still, there were no new attacks. Had the Axeman moved on to another city? Had he been arrested for another crime, his true nature never discovered? Or had he simply died, taking his secrets to the grave? In the absence of new attacks, the case began to fade from the headlines, but the fear he instilled never truly disappeared. Theories about his identity continued to spread. Some believed he had been a member of the mafia, enforcing violent retribution on those who had wronged the organization. Others insisted he had been a mentally unstable butcher or laborer, his choice of weapon indicating a background in handling sharp tools. There were even those who believed he was something supernatural, a demon. One of the most popular theories centered around a man named Joseph Mumford. Mumford was a known criminal with a history of extortion and violence. In a shocking twist, in December 1920, he was shot and killed in Los Angeles by the widow of one of the Axeman's suspected victims. She claimed that he had been the one responsible for her husband's murder. This revelation led some to believe that Mumford had been the Axeman all along and that his reign of terror had ended with his own death. However, despite countless investigations, the Axeman of New Orleans was never identified. No one was ever arrested, no one ever confessed, and no definitive proof was ever uncovered. He remained an enigma, a faceless horror that had left a permanent scar on the city's history. Even after his disappearance, his legacy endured. The fear he instilled lingered, and his story became legend. Parents warned their children about the Axeman, jazz musicians immortalized him in song, and true crime enthusiasts continued. Though he was never caught, the Axeman left behind a chilling reminder of how one figure, unseen and unknown, could hold an entire city hostage with fear. His crimes may have faded into history, but his story will never truly be forgotten. Even now, more than a century later, his name still lingers in the shadows of New Orleans, a whisper on the wind that reminds people of the terror that once stalked their streets. The mystery of the Axeman of New Orleans continues to haunt historians, criminologists, and true crime enthusiasts alike. Over a century has passed, yet his identity remains unknown, his motives unclear. The lack of concrete evidence and the abrupt end to his crimes have led to countless theories, each one attempting to make sense of a case that defies explanation. One of the most persistent theories suggests that the Axeman was connected to organized crime. Many of his victims were Italian-American grocers, leading some to believe that he was acting as an enforcer, eliminating those who refused to pay protection money. The early 20th century was a time when the Black Hand, an extortion syndicate tied to the Italian mafia, was active in many American cities, including New Orleans. Could the Axeman have been their hired killer, carrying out violent retribution under the company? Another theory suggests that the Axeman was not a professional killer, but rather a sadistic thrill-seeker who relished in the fear he created. His crimes showed a level of calculated brutality, but they lacked any clear financial or personal gain. Unlike typical contract killings, his attacks were unnecessarily violent, and he left his victims in gruesome states. The fact that he never stole anything pointed to a motive beyond money. Some experts have suggested he may have been a psychotic individual. A more bizarre theory revolves around the Axeman's infamous letter to the newspaper, in which he claimed to be a supernatural being who demanded jazz in exchange for sparing lives. Some have speculated that the letter was nothing more than a hoax, possibly written by a journalist to fuel the fear and hysteria already gripping the city. However, others believe that the Axeman himself may have written it, playing a psychological game with the public. If so, this suggests that he enjoyed the power he held. Then there is the possibility that the Axeman was more than one person. Some criminologists have speculated that multiple killers may have been operating under the same guise, either as copycats or as part of a larger conspiracy. The varying descriptions given by witnesses support this idea. Some described a tall, heavy-set man, while others claimed he was slender and agile. If multiple people were involved, it would explain the inconsistencies in the attacks and why no single suspect was ever caught. Despite these theories, the truth about the Axeman of New Orleans remains elusive. No definitive suspect was ever identified, and no physical evidence was ever recovered. His ability to disappear without a trace only adds to the legend. Did he die before he could strike again? Was he arrested for another crime under a different name? Or did he simply move to another city and continue his killings elsewhere? The unanswered questions surrounding the Axeman's identity are what keep his story alive. Unlike many serial killers whose motives and backgrounds can be studied, the Axeman is a ghost and unsolved puzzle that will likely never be completed. His crimes may have ended in 1919, but his legend has endured, an unsettling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we never catch. Even though the Axeman vanished, his story continued to captivate the people of New Orleans and beyond. The brutal murders, the bizarre letter to the press, and his sudden disappearance left behind a mystery that has never been solved. Over the decades, investigators, writers, and historians have attempted to piece together the truth, but no single theory has ever been definitively proven. One of the most intriguing possibilities is that the Axeman was Joseph Mumford, a known criminal and extortionist who was active in New Orleans during the time of the killings. In a strange twist, Mumford was shot and killed in Los Angeles in 1920 by the widow of one of the Axeman's suspected victims. She claimed that he was responsible for her husband's death and that she had taken justice into her own hands. This led some to believe that the Axeman had finally been identified. However, there was no con. Another theory suggests that the Axeman was a transient killer, someone who traveled from city to city, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. If this were true, it would explain why the attacks in New Orleans suddenly stopped. Perhaps he had moved on to another place, continuing his crimes under a different name. Some criminologists have noted similarities between the Axeman's attacks and other unsolved murders in different parts of the country. Could he have been one of America's first documented? Others have speculated that the Axeman's crimes were part of a larger conspiracy. Some believe he may have been hired by a secretive organization, possibly tied to organized crime, to eliminate certain individuals. The fact that so many of his victims were Italian grocers has fueled this idea, though there is little concrete evidence to support it. Still, the randomness of his killings and the lack of any apparent motive make this theory as plausible as any other. Despite these theories, the truth about the Axeman remains as elusive as ever. The lack of surviving evidence, combined with the passage of time, makes it unlikely that his identity will ever be confirmed. The case has remained open for over a century, and yet, no new leads have emerged. He remains one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries, a specter that lingers in the dark history of New Orleans. As the years passed, the legend of the Axeman only grew. His story has inspired books, movies, and television shows, cementing his place in popular culture. He is often depicted as a supernatural figure, a ghostly entity that still haunts the city. Whether he was a lone madman, a hired assassin, or something else entirely, his legacy is undeniable. The mystery of the Axeman endures, a chilling reminder that some questions may never be answered. His victims are long gone, his crimes have faded into history, but his name remains a whisper in the dark, a tale of terror that refuses to be forgotten. As the years passed and the Axeman faded into history, his story continued to evolve. What had once been a horrifying series of real-life murders transformed into something more: a legend, a ghost story, a mystery that refused to be forgotten. Though the Axeman himself may have disappeared, the fear he instilled never truly left New Orleans. Historians and crime researchers have spent decades attempting to unravel the truth. Many have pointed out that the Axeman's crimes were unique, not just in their brutality but in their eerie theatricality. Unlike other serial killers, he did not appear to have a personal connection to his victims, nor did he seem interested in robbery or revenge. His attacks were random, unpredictable, and, most disturbingly, seemingly without motive. One of the most baffling elements of the case is the infamous letter published in the Times-Picayune. If the letter was genuine, it suggests that the Axeman enjoyed playing with the public's fear, turning his crimes into something almost ritualistic. But was it truly written by him, or was it an elaborate hoax designed to further the hysteria? If it was real, what kind of killer announces his intentions in advance, taunts the authorities, and claims to be a supernatural force? Some have speculated that the Axeman may have suffered from a psychological disorder, possibly schizophrenia or another condition that blurred his perception of reality. His ability to slip into homes undetected, kill with terrifying precision, and then vanish without a trace led some to believe that he was more than just a man. He was something unstoppable, a force of nature that could not be caught. Others argue that the Axeman was simply an opportunistic killer who used the chaos of the time to his advantage. The early 1900s were a violent era in American history, and law enforcement was ill-equipped to deal with a murderer who left behind so little evidence. Without fingerprints, forensic analysis, or modern investigative techniques, police were left chasing ghosts. And in the end, that is exactly what the Axeman became: a ghost. Despite the theories, the case remains officially unsolved. No suspects were ever convicted, no confessions were ever made, and no deathbed revelations ever came forward. The Axeman of New Orleans remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in true crime history. Even now, his story lingers, retold in books, documentaries, and crime podcasts. Tourists still visit the locations of his attacks, hoping to catch a glimpse of the past. Some even say that his spirit haunts the streets of New Orleans, a shadowy figure forever lurking in the city's darkest corners. Whether the Axeman was a madman, a criminal, or something beyond human understanding, one thing is certain: his name will never be forgotten. The Axeman of New Orleans remains one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries in American history. More than a century later, his identity, motives, and ultimate fate continue to elude investigators and historians alike. While many killers from that era were eventually caught or at least identified, the Axeman seemed to disappear into the shadows, leaving behind only questions and fear. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case is the lack of a clear profile. Unlike many serial killers, who have specific patterns, the Axeman's choice of victims varied. While many of his targets were Italian grocers, others had no connection to that demographic. Some survived their attacks, while others were killed instantly. His method of entry was always eerily silent, and his ability to disappear without a trace made him seem almost supernatural. Over the years, comparisons have been drawn between the Axeman and other infamous killers, such as Jack the Ripper. Both men struck with brutality, taunted the authorities, and left behind little to no evidence. Both cases also sparked waves of fear and paranoia, changing the way people lived their daily lives. Yet, unlike Jack the Ripper, whose crimes were confined to a small district in London, the Axeman's reach extended beyond New Orleans. The attack on the Cortemilia family in Gretna proved the psychological impact of the Axeman's crimes lasted long after his final attack. Even after he seemingly vanished, people in New Orleans continued to live in fear. Locking doors became a more common practice, and residents remained wary of unseen threats. The legend of the Axeman took on a life of its own, becoming part of the city's folklore. Parents told their children stories about him as a warning to be cautious, and jazz musicians immortalized him in song, forever linking him to the music that Today, the Axeman's story continues to captivate true crime enthusiasts. His tale has been adapted into novels, movies, and even television shows. Some portray him as a brutal, methodical killer, while others lean into the supernatural elements of his legend. His infamous letter to the press remains one of the strangest and most chilling aspects of the case. Was it a genuine message from the killer, or a hoax meant to stir fear? The truth may never be known. For those who study unsolved crimes, the Axeman represents the ultimate mystery. He defied capture, avoided justice, and vanished without a trace. Without modern forensic science, there is little hope that his identity will ever be discovered. But in some ways, that may be what keeps his legend alive. He is more than just a historical criminal, he is a ghost, a lingering presence in the dark corners of New Orleans history. Though the streets of New Orleans are no longer filled with fear of the Axeman, his story still echoes in the city's past. The mystery remains, unsolved and unforgettable, a reminder that sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are the ones that are never caught.